Welcome to the Keeping It Israel podcast with Jeff Feuders, where Jeff and his guests talk everything Israel as it relates to Christian faith and the church. If you are a Christian and you stand with Israel, you will be encouraged and challenged by this podcast. And if you're not so sure about the whole Israel thing, you need to learn how your faith connects with Israel and why standing with Israel matters. Now here's Jeff with today's guest.
Well, welcome back to the podcast today, and it is hard to believe, but this is the last podcast in our series with pastor and author Gene Binder from Boulder, Colorado. Gene, welcome back.
I agree. 6 weeks goes by pretty fast, so thank you for having me back.
Oh, hey, it's our pleasure. And if you've missed any of these podcasts, you're going to need to go back and listen to the last 5. But we've been talking about Gene's book, Connecting the Dots. And that's something that you're going to want to pick up because in this podcast series, we scratched the surface of only 5 of the 7 foreshadows that Gene talks about in the book. Gene, as we have done in the last number of weeks, could you just give us that quick sort of overview of the 3 episodes and the 7 foreshadows so that everybody kind of is reminded about what we're talking about?
Sure. So if you're tuning back, you recall that the book looks at history in the Bible as one beautiful, seamless love story, not 2 stories, not a Jewish story that became a Christian story, but one story from beginning to end, from the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation. And it basically takes kind of a 30,000 foot drone's eye view of that history. And specifically, it looks at the role that the Jewish play throughout the entire story. And it looks at it kind of like a trilogy, not kind of, it is. Look, God's story plays out like a trilogy in 3 episodes. The first episode are prophetic pictures of the past, which we typically call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. Those become messianic fulfillments in the messianic era that we live in today. It began when Jesus, Yeshua, showed up 2,000 years ago. But we have one more episode to go before this story concludes, and that is the story of New Jerusalem, once the Messiah returns, establishes his eternal kingdom. They all play out, there's 7 foreshadows. I'll go through them real quickly. They all play out in this kind of tri-episode format. And each one of them tells the story, the gospel story in a really unique way. And if you're tuning in for the first time today, you hit the right one because this one really nails it. They all do, but this one is particularly kind of, in my mind, the queen of the foreshadows. So they start out, the first shadow starts out with the covenant that God makes to Abraham, and that foreshadow kind of typifies a marriage, or at least a pledge to be married. In the first episode, it's an engagement that goes wrong. Israel cheats on God multiple times, and it looks like the relationship's over. Jesus shows up in the second episode, reconciles the relationship. But in the third episode, we finally get to the marriage, the wedding feast of the Lamb that read about in Revelation chapter 21. So if you think about that, if we start with a marriage, then usually what follows a marriage are the kids, and that's the nation of Israel. That's the second foreshadow. That's the family. Once you have a marriage and a family, you need a place to live. That's the promised land. That's the family home. Once you have a marriage and children and you have a place to live, then you need a good set of family rules, and that's the role of the Torah, also called the law. And so you have marriage, kids, place to live, a good set of healthy rules. Every smart dad knows to give his kids lots of access. That is the foreshadow of the temple. It starts out kind of weird. God's in the back room in a place called the most holy place. But as we move through the other 2 episodes, it gets closer and closer until finally you can't get any closer to God. And that's a beautiful foreshadow as well. Then we have the Sabbath, which are the weekly family times, but we frame it in a way that it moves from a 24-hour day of rest to, and it's not really resting like jumping up on the couch and taking a nap. That's not what God did after he rested from creation. He's been managing his creation ever since. It's 24 hours to live differently, to live to serve the Lord, to be with your family and friends. In the second episode, that moves to 24/7, 365 days a year, resting, that we're ceasing from our own works. That's how we find salvation, is we cannot work our way to God. We have to stop. And then finally, that third episode, we're always going to be giving our time and energy to God and the family that he's trying to create here, which is the ultimate purpose of this book, is demonstrate God's plan to make an eternal family. So today we come to the feast, and I call this the family reunions, but I also kind of have a tag that it's all about going home. This is a foreshadow that actually talks about all of God's plan throughout the entire course of history to get us back home. We're I don't know if you ever thought about it, but we are the not yet home people. We will one day, Peter calls us aliens and strangers. Some of us are more alien and strange than others, but I probably fit that category. You do too, Jeff. And but someday God's going to bring us home, and all of these 7 foreshadows take us home, but this one particularly gets us home.
Yeah, yeah. This has been an amazing journey, and of course, if you've read the book like I have, this is the one we've all been sort of waiting to get to. But I know that you're going to enjoy this today if you're watching, listening. It's interesting how that in the Jewish society, the children of Israel, that all of these family gatherings or things that God commanded them to do, the feasts of the Lord, the first 3 or 4 of them focus around kind of the agrarian society that the Jewish people were a part of, and you're gonna tell us what this is all about. So I don't want to spoil anything that you're going to share, but we have 7 of these to get through today, really kind of quickly. So I'm going to just let you lead us into what this looks like and how these all foreshadow and get fulfilled in Messiah, Yeshua.
Sure. And I think we have plenty of time to get through all of these. So no panicking here.
Okay. All right.
Watching the clock. I think we'll get to about the same amount of time. I would like to say, this whole idea of not being home yet comes from Father Abraham. I don't know if you know this or not, but he's called the first Hebrew, and the word Hebrew in Hebrew is Ivrit, and it's also the name for the language as well, the Hebrew language, Ivrit, but the word Hebrew, and he's called the first Hebrew, and we're also told that God came to him, and he came to him. I'm just trying to in Joshua kind of retells this story in Joshua 24:3. He says, I took Father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him through Canaan and gave him many descendants. And so he's talking about when God came to Abraham and made a promise to him, he told him to cross over or go beyond the Euphrates. It's thought that Abraham's the word Hebrew comes from Abraham's great grandfather, Ever. It's interesting because the word for beyond is Ever, to the land beyond, or cross over the Euphrates. And if you think about it, to be a Hebrew is to be a not yet home person. It's like the word for fetus for an unborn in Hebrew comes from this root word. In soccer, in the game of soccer, when you get a penalty, it's called avera, and it means that you've crossed over a line. So it has this crossover, and Abraham crossed over the Euphrates and eventually into the Promised Land, but we are one day going to cross over into the Promised Land as well. And I decided I'd say that because it will mean something as we talk about the feast, that we are the not yet home people. Eventually, we're going to cross over that spiritual Jordan River, and our feet will land in the Promised Land, the eternal New Jerusalem. So, anyways,
I like it. Not to derail you, but you know, when you say not yet people, it makes me think of
not yet home people. Not yet home people.
Not yet home people. Okay. Not yet home people. But it also makes me think of Yeshua and his words about the kingdom. And maybe that's going to become part of this, but carry on.
It will. So these 3 episodes play. I'll just kind of give a spoiler about what in episode 1, the prophetic picture of the past. It's a gathering of the crops. These are all, you know, the feasts are like a mix of agrarian and spiritual observations, you know, and celebrations. It's kind of an odd mix, and it goes in and out of these 2 things. And so, but it's all about gathering. And in the first episode, it's about gathering the physical crops, the actual harvest crops, grain harvest crops. In the second episode, it turns into gathering souls. And in the final and complete picture that we get in New Jerusalem, it's gathering the family, which is amazing. So in Leviticus 23, we see these feasts outlined, and God starts out in verse 4 saying, "These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times." And it gets, you know, it's interesting, that word for feast, these are the Lord's appointed feasts to proclaim at their appointed times. It's the same Hebrew word, moedim, which really best translates into appointed times. That there's something mysterious about these things. They're timetables. They're appointed times. Just like in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything and a season for everything under activity under the heavens. You know, these are appointed times. The seasons have appointed times. The stars have appointed times. It's fascinating to look at what in this universe has appointed times. I mean, if there were no appointed times, you and I and everybody else on this planet wouldn't be alive. But we have this cycle that we go through, and that's what an agrarian cycle is all about. It is something that goes every year, and I'll talk about that just a second. But one thing I want to point out is a lot of people say these are the Jewish feasts, and they're really not our feasts as Christians. But this is what the text says. The text says these are the Lord's Moedim. So they're God's. And I usually, when I speak, I say, how many of you follow the Lord? And of course, it puts everyone in a box. I do. Okay, so these are important to us. I think if God wanted us to just dial in that these were for the Jewish people only, he would have said so. These are God's appointed times, and they're pretty amazing. So I think the first place to start is that the very first one begins in the spring, and that's Passover. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Pesach, Passover. I mean, literally, the word Pesach means that when the Jews marked their doorposts from the angel of death coming for all the firstborn in Egypt, the angel of death would pass over their homes. A lot of people think it's a very much more complex word, but it's not. It just literally means Passover. But it's so important to talk about when God starts these and when he ends them, and he starts them in spring. And if you think about it, you know, you and I don't know where everyone else is living, but we're in the middle of a pretty strong Arctic weather front. Has it hit you where you're living? Yeah.
Yes.
I went to church last week. I left my house. It was -6, which is really rare for Colorado. And
can I share? This morning was the coldest morning of the winter so far here where I live in Barrie, Ontario, Canada, and it was minus 18 Celsius, which is 18 below freezing in our degrees. So it was chilly today, and
Yeah.
we got about 10 inches of snow yesterday, or
Yeah.
20 centimeters, which a little over 20 centimeters. So yeah, we're right in the middle of the vortex. And I mentioned to you when we first got on here that Jerusalem is getting snow today. So we can identify with this winter spring metaphor you're going to share with us right now.
The appointed seasons of the year mean something, and God uses that in the agrarian cycle. If you think about it, the feasts end in the fall. So basically, once they're over and it repeats, we go into winter, which is where we're at. We're in the dead of winter right now. What does winter remind us of? It reminds us of things are dormant and dying. And in not so much in our culture, actually not at all in our culture, but still in a lot of cultures today, and for sure in the cultures back in ancient times, winter was a scary time because you never knew if you had enough supplies to make it through the winter. And so it's like, are we going to make it? Do we get enough stored away? It's running down. How long? When's this going to break? Type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, spring comes on the scene, and grain starts popping out of the ground. Animals start having their foes, their babies, their yearlings, and it's like it's hope, right? There's hope now.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Yeah,
going to
right.
be okay.
Right.
We're going to be okay. Well, this is the season that God chose to bring the Messiah to the cross with a statement that we're going to be okay. Right? That's what Passover is. Passover falls, typically late March to the middle of April on our calendar, but it's in the month of Nisan. So Exodus 12:2, God says to Hebrew, the month Nisan is to be for you the first month of your year. And he told that to Moses. Now we have our first month in January, and sadly, most Jews today celebrate their first month in September on Rosh Hashanah, right? Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. But that's not that is not a feast that God gave to the Jewish people or gave to us. That came later on in the Babylonian exile. The biblical New Year is the month of Nisan, where Passover falls. That's the first of the year. So if you think about chronologically, how does the years work? It goes from spring to winter.
Mm-hmm.
And then winter begins to dissolve and spring comes, and then we have Passover. So what is Passover? Passover, I'm just going to talk real quickly about what they mean in the Jewish world, and then we'll talk about how they got fulfilled. Okay, so Passover or Pesach is a commemoration of God delivering the Jewish people out of slavery from Egypt. And if your listeners are not aware, God comes to Moses. Moses was living in Pharaoh's household. He ends up killing an Egyptian, and he flees for his life. And some 40 years later, he has an encounter with God with the burning bush. And God says, hey, Moses, if I got a job for you, you're going to go back and you're going to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And there's a whole great story for that alone that we could spend a long time talking about. But Moses goes, and it's not easy. It takes 10 plagues. But in the last plague, where the angel of death comes and takes every firstborn, right? It wasn't just Egyptian firstborn. It was every firstborn in the land. The only way that the Jewish people could be protected is if they took an unblemished lamb, slit its throat, took its blood, and mark the tops and the sides of the doorposts of their house. And if they did, the angel of death would pass over them. If they didn't, it wouldn't. And I can, it doesn't say so, but I can imagine that some people didn't. And if they didn't, then they would have the same consequences that happened to the Egyptians or anybody else living in the land, for that matter. So that's Passover. That's really a one-day feast on the 14th of Nisan. The next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's the second feast. That lasts for 7 days. And we call that Hag HaMotzah, or it's where we get the word matzah from, the holiday of the matzah. And it's incredible. I don't know if you've ever been in Israel, Jeff, the week before Passover, but the Jews are commanded to get rid of all forms of leaven in their home. And you'd be surprised what has leaven in it. It's not just bread or muffins. It's in soy sauce. It's in all kinds of things. And the Jewish people take this really seriously. I had a group once, and we had to leave the hotel because that was the day they were going to go through and get rid of all the leaven. A lot of Jewish people, if you're a person of means, you'll actually go stay in a hotel after they've removed it because you just don't want to hassle doing it in your own home. It's quite rigorous to do this. You got to pull all your sofa cushions up, your mattress, vacuum the floors. It's crazy. But it's really important. And I just want to underscore how important it is to get rid of that leaven. Okay. That'll make sense in a little bit. Maybe some people are already thinking ahead. That takes 7 days to what's called early first fruits, Yom HaBikurim, early first fruits. And we're not really told, you can read about all these in Leviticus 23. We're not really told, there's not a date on the calendar for this. The date to celebrate this is the day after the Sabbath that falls during the Feast of Unleavened Bread or during Passover. Today we melt, Passover and unleavened bread together and just call it all Passover. But and so if you're thinking, it's a 7-day feast. The Sabbath falls on what day?
Saturday.
On our calendar, on Saturday. There is no Saturday.
Shabbat.
They call it Shabbat. Yeah. All the other days have numbers, like day 1, day 2, day 3. So if it's the day after Shabbat, what day of the week would we celebrate it? In Israel, they'd call it the first day, day 1, but we call it Sunday. Sunday. So here's what's commanded. The Jewish farmers were to take the first sprigs out of the ground, probably barley at that time of year. Wheat comes a little bit later. Take the first sprig of barley out of the ground. So it's just going to be a little tiny thing, right? Bring it to the temple. Give it to the high priest, and he's going to make a wave offering. It doesn't say this, but the idea behind the wave offering is this. If God is faithful to bring these first sprigs out of the ground, he'll be faithful to bring the rest of the harvest later on. You could see how that'd be a blessing to a farmer, right? That's kind of a promise that the rest of the harvest will come. And so from that point on, then you start counting 50 days. That's called the counting of the Omer. 50 days. And there's a prayer that's said every day, and then you end it with Yom Echad, which would be day 1. And then the prayer next day, Yom Shani, and you'd go day 2. And it's like a count, it's a count up, but it's basically a countdown. You're counting to something. What are you counting to? You're counting to the 4th feast, which is in Hebrew, Shavuot. If you're a Christian and you read your Bible a lot, then you'd find this feast in Acts chapter 2, where the disciples are in the upper room, and it's called Pentecost, which means it's Greek for 50. but we're counting off 50 days.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a countdown. So, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 45, day 46, day 48, day 49, boom, day 50. What does it celebrate? The beginning of the grain harvest. By that time the sprigs are mature, it's time to start the harvest. It's not going to be exact because, you can't control the harvest that much, but there's a day to celebrate this. Today, it gets lost in its observance because today the Jewish people celebrate it as the giving of the Torah. It's thought that the Jews took 50 days to get to Mount Sinai, but there's nothing in Scripture. The Scriptures talk about it being a grain celebration, and there's specific verses for that. So now we have, those are the 4, what we call the spring feasts. And then you have a break. There's no feast during summer. Why? Because it's harvest time, right? I mean, you have a short window of time to get that harvest in. If you miss it, you're not going to get your food. And so there's no harvest during the summertime until the end, until we get to the fall. And then the very first one is called the Feast of Trumpets, or Yom Teruah, which literally means the day of blowing, blasting. And the commands are just to blast different kinds of horn sounds all day long. What is it celebrating? It's celebrating the end of the grain harvest. There'll be some more harvest. There'll be figs and things like that, apples, things like that, still coming, but the grain harvest is over. Now, you'd think, hallelujah, we've just gone through this incredible time. The Lord was faithful. The rest of the harvest came, just like the high priest promised. It's time to celebrate, but it's not. Yom Teruah starts the most solemn days, 10 days, called the days of awe, the most solemn days in the life of a Jew, because we start praying that this is the day that God opens up the book of life and decides whose name is going to get in it for the next year. Mm-hmm. And so there is no celebrating. It's actually a lot of pleading and praying. And you do that for 10 days leading up to the most solemn of all the feasts, which is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where, in Israel, it goes dark. I mean, if you walk around, and actually instead of just one day, it's a Sabbath for 2 days. And trust me, if you're walking around making noise, it's not going to go well for you. It is so solemn and so sacred. And here in the States, it's the biggest holiday that Jews go out to attend. It's even bigger than Passover. Most synagogues rent churches or larger auditoriums because they swell too much. They can't keep that many people. And you're praying. It's a day of prayer. Now, it used to be, I think we talked about this in a previous podcast. It used to be when the temple was around that the Jewish people would bring a bull or a goat and give it to the high priest. The high priest would slash his throat and go into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat of God. And if you survived the experience, he'd come out, and it was an atonement, a national day of atonement, that people would give a collective sigh. We're good for a year. Mm-hmm. That's the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And then finally, that leads to the seventh feast, the final one, which is the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacle. In Hebrew, it's Sukkot, where God commands the Jewish people to build these booths. And you'd have typically 3 walls. The ceiling had to be, it could be completely open, or you could have like lattice or something on it. But you had to be able to see the stars because you're looking to the heavens. Mm-hmm. And the command was, for 7 days, live in this booth, eat, invite friends. It's a celebration. This is the celebration, and decorate the walls with the bounty of the harvest. All right, so that's kind of a brief pattern without going into how we celebrate it. By the way, if you're going to go to Israel and you want to be there for one of the feasts, Sukkot is the best one to be at. All the restaurants put out a sukkah. Sukkot is just plural for booths. Sukkah is singular booth. Most people live in apartments. They have balconies. They put a sukkah on there. It's just quite festive. And you're going to be able to either eat in a sukkah at a restaurant or somebody's home. It's a time to purposely invite people to come eat with you. That's the time to go.
And Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot is how long? It's also a week long, right?
7 days.
7 days.
Yeah, we talked about that. I'm not sure if we did talk about it, but yeah, it's that story in John where Jesus says, "I'm the if anyone's thirsty, come to me, and out of him will flow streams or rivers." Well, he starts off that by saying, "In the last and greatest day of the feast," Jesus said, "If you're thirsty." Well, the last and greatest day of the feast is the last day of Sukkot. It's a special holiday. It's called Hoshiana Rabbah. Hosanna. Rabbah means great. So it's basically, it's the great save me now. So we can't get into that one because that's going a little off course, but that's knowing the context of that story is amazing. If somebody wants to Google that story and particularly type in the word messianic and see what that last and greatest feast was, you'll be blown away by it. So much detail that God gives us if we have the context.
It is amazing.
Let's go.
I'll let you go there in 1 second. I just want to say that you kind of whet my appetite for being in Israel over Sukkot.
Oh.
I've been for Pesach, and that's a very unique experience all its own, but never for Sukkot. So on my bucket list.
Yeah, Pesach or Passover is a great time to be there, but all the great breads and pastries disappear.
I know. And
it all comes out for Sukkot.
Remember I told you my sabbatical story and my first Shabbat? Well, I was there over Pesach at that same time. And you can't, during those 7 days, it's hard to get anything bread-like that tastes any good in Jerusalem, for sure.
I think it's changed. I haven't been in Passover in several years because gluten-free is now a big deal in Israel. Back then, they had one little something that just tasted, it tasted worse than cardboard. If you wanted to have something like that. Yeah, but we digress.
Yes, we do digress. And here's what we're going to do. The conversation with Gene today went on so long that we thought it would be better for us to really put this into 2 podcasts. And so today you get the overview of the feasts. Next week, we're going to talk about how Jesus fulfills all of these and how this incredible foreshadow of the feasts is one of the most amazing things in Scripture as we look forward to the future and understand all that Jesus has done for us and all that he has fulfilled through these amazing appointed times or feasts of the Lord. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Gene today. Thanks for joining us for the podcast. And listen, don't forget to go get Gene's book. That is boldjourney.com/books, boldjourney.com/books, plural. And you're going to want to pick that up because we really have just been scratching the surface. I've said this a number of times, but you really are going to want to read the book. And I know that you'll get the best deal there at Gene's site. You can also get a Kindle version on Amazon, and we encourage you to check that out. Listen, last thing, we are a ministry. We're a charity who helps ministries in the land of Israel. We are so grateful for so many who have leaned in and helped us and have supported and really enabled us, equipped us to be able to equip ministries in Israel that we have vetted, that we trust, that are doing good work there in the land of Israel, humanitarian aid and outreach and so many other things. And so we just would appreciate it if you would think about supporting the ministry. If you enjoy this podcast, if you like our YouTube content, if you watch our show, or if you love Israel, just go to our website, firstcenturyfoundations.com/donate, firstcenturyfoundations.com/donate, and you can make a donation there and be receipted for your giving, both in Canada and the United States. Thank you so much for listening today. God bless you, and remember, as Christians, we stand with Israel.